The time is exactly 3:14 a.m. in a damp, aggressively humming server room. An exhausted archivist frantically hits the spacebar on a dusty keyboard, hoping to salvage a damaged digital file. The screen flickers, revealing a grainy, silent security feed of a sterile interrogation room. A man sits alone at the metal table. He looks up, stares directly into the hidden camera lens, and smiles. The screen abruptly cuts to black, replaced by a flashing error message reading "File corrupted." The public has always been told that this man, Arthur Pendleton, vanished without a trace into the snowy wilderness after suffering a tragic psychological breakdown. That narrative is a complete fabrication. Arthur did not wander into the woods to die, nor did he run away to start a new life. He was systematically erased from existence by the very institution that led the search party, and the footage proving his captivity was hidden in plain sight. The winter illusion. To understand how a human being can simply be deleted from the world, we have to look at the environment that allowed it to happen. The town of Oakhaven was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, yet nobody asked too many questions. It was surrounded by dense, unforgiving forests and subjected to brutal winters that could bury a house in snow overnight. Arthur Pendleton was a well-respected local accountant. He was a quiet man who kept his head down, paid his taxes, and spent his weekends repairing an old boat in his garage. He was entirely unremarkable, which made his sudden disappearance in the middle of a harsh December blizzard the defining event of the decade for the small community. According to the official police report, Arthur left his office late on a Tuesday evening. His car was found abandoned on the edge of a rural highway, miles away from his normal route home. The driver's side door was left wide open, and the keys were still in the ignition. The engine had run until the gas tank was completely empty. A massive search party was organized the very next morning. Hundreds of volunteers trudged through knee-deep snow, calling his name into the freezing wind. The local police precinct, led by the highly decorated Chief Robert Vance, coordinated the entire effort. They brought in tracking dogs, launched helicopters when the weather permitted, and scoured every square inch of the woods bordering the highway. They found nothing. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no torn clothing, and no indication that Arthur had been the victim of foul play. Within a few weeks, the search was called off. Chief Vance held a somber press conference in front of the town hall. He stood before the flashing cameras and delivered a tragic, easily digestible narrative. He explained that Arthur had been dealing with unspoken financial pressures and severe seasonal depression. Chief Vance concluded that Arthur had suffered a sudden, severe psychological breakdown, wandered into the freezing woods in a state of delirium, and succumbed to the elements. The town accepted this explanation because it was comfortable. It was a tragedy, but it made sense. The elements were harsh, and the human mind is fragile. A memorial service was held, an empty casket was lowered into the frozen ground, and the community mourned the loss of a good man. The case was officially closed, boxed up, and sent to the basement archives of the police precinct. Arthur Pendleton became nothing more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked mental illness and the unforgiving nature of winter. The widow's crusade. However, there was one person who refused to accept the official story. Arthur's wife, Eleanor, knew her husband better than anyone else. She knew he did not have financial troubles because he managed their money with meticulous care. She knew he did not suffer from depression, and she knew he despised the cold. He would never have left a warm car to walk into a blizzard. More importantly, she knew about the encrypted files he had been reviewing on his home computer the week before he vanished. Eleanor began a relentless campaign to force the police to reopen the investigation. She hired independent auditors, spoke to local reporters, and filed endless freedom of information requests. She hit a bureaucratic wall at every turn. The police department refused to release the case files, citing privacy concerns and the definitive conclusion of their investigation. But Eleanor was intelligent, and she understood the legal framework governing police records. This brings us to a crucial piece of context regarding missing persons cases in the early 2000s. During this era, police departments were transitioning from analog paper files to digital archives. To prevent data loss during this clumsy transition, a strict legal mandate was put in place for all active investigations. Every piece of digital evidence, especially precinct security footage, had to be backed up in triplicate. This meant there was a master server, a localized hard drive backup, and a physical tape backup stored in a secure off-site facility. The system was designed to be foolproof. It was meant to ensure that evidence could never be accidentally lost or destroyed by a simple hardware failure. Eleanor focused her legal battle entirely on this triplicate rule. She petitioned the state courts to force the precinct to release the internal security tapes from the night Arthur disappeared. She argued that if Arthur had truly suffered a breakdown, his movements earlier in the day might have been captured by the cameras in and around town, including the traffic cameras maintained by the precinct's servers. The local judge eventually agreed with her and signed a court order compelling the police department to hand over the digital archives for that specific week. When the hard drives were finally delivered to Eleanor's legal team, they were completely empty. The data had not been corrupted by time or degraded by poor storage. The drives had been wiped clean using military-grade deletion software. The off-site physical tapes were also reported missing, supposedly destroyed in a routine basement flood that had miraculously only affected that specific box of evidence. This application of the triplicate rule changes the entire nature of the mystery. The sheer impossibility of all three backup systems failing simultaneously proved that human intervention was required. The footage did not vanish by accident. It was deliberately and painstakingly erased by someone who understood the system. Someone with the high-level security clearance necessary to access the master servers and the off-site facility. Eleanor had proven that a cover-up had occurred, but she still lacked the evidence to show what the police were actually hiding. The impossible fragment. The breakthrough came 3 years later, in the form of a padded envelope slipped under the door of a private investigator named Julian Hayes. Julian was a man who specialized in cold cases and digital forensics. He had built a reputation for recovering data that other people claimed was permanently lost. The envelope contained no letter, no return address, and no explanation. It held only a single heavily damaged hard drive. Julian spent weeks carefully extracting data from the scorched platters of the drive. He discovered that the drive belonged to a former precinct archivist who had been quietly fired a year after Arthur's disappearance. The archivist had attempted to save a fragment of the deleted security footage before the system was completely wiped. The recovery process was tedious, requiring Julian to piece together broken lines of code to reconstruct the video file. When the image finally stabilized on his monitor, he witnessed something that shattered the entire foundation of the case. He expected to see footage of a violent altercation. He thought the police might have covered up an accidental shooting or a brutal interrogation that went too far. What he saw was far more disturbing because it was so mundane. The video showed a sterile, brightly lit interrogation room inside the Oakhaven police precinct. The walls were painted a dull grey, and a large two-way mirror dominated the right side of the frame. Arthur Pendleton was sitting at the metal table in the center of the room. He was not handcuffed. He did not look injured, panicked, or distressed. He was wearing a clean white shirt, and he was calmly drinking a cup of coffee. He looked directly into the hidden camera lens and smiled, a relaxed, knowing smile that suggested he was entirely aware of being filmed. But the visual of Arthur sitting in a police station was not the most shocking detail. The true horror of the footage was the digital timestamp glowing in the bottom right corner of the screen. Julian enhanced the image, zooming in on the glowing green numbers. He cross-referenced the date and time with the official case file. He checked the data multiple times, assuming his recovery software had made an error. The software was flawless. The timestamp proved that the video was recorded 3 full days after the police officially declared Arthur dead. It was recorded 3 days after the town held a memorial service, and 3 days after Eleanor watched an empty casket get lowered into the frozen ground. Arthur was alive, sitting comfortably inside the local police precinct, long after his own funeral. The police had not failed to find him in the woods. They had him in their custody the entire time, and they had actively orchestrated a massive, fraudulent search party to convince the town that he was gone forever. The private eye. Julian Hayes was not a man who frightened easily. He had spent his entire adult life wading through the dark underbelly of human nature. He worked out of a cramped, dimly lit apartment in the city, surrounded by towering stacks of legal documents and the constant hum of cooling fans from his custom-built computer servers. He was meticulous, patient, and deeply cynical. He knew that people lied, but data always told the truth. When Julian realized the implications of the timestamp, he knew he was holding a piece of evidence that could dismantle the entire Oakhaven Police Department. He also knew that the people who had gone to such immense lengths to erase Arthur Pendleton would not hesitate to do the same to anyone who uncovered their secret. Julian decided to operate entirely in the shadows. He did not contact Eleanor, and he did not bring the fragment to the state authorities. He needed to build an airtight case before he made a single public move. He began constructing a digital map of the Oakhaven precinct's hierarchy. He bypassed basic firewalls and accessed the town's municipal records, looking for financial irregularities, hidden property transfers, and classified personnel files. He was searching for the mechanism the police use to hide a living person. A precinct could not simply hold a man indefinitely without generating some kind of paper trail. Food had to be purchased, medical care had to be provided, and guards had to be paid to keep quiet. His investigation led him directly to Chief Robert Vance. On the surface, Vance was a pillar of the community. He was a veteran officer who had won multiple awards for his service and was frequently quoted in the local newspaper talking about the importance of transparency in law enforcement. But Julian's digital excavation revealed a completely different man. Deep within a secured county database, Julian uncovered a series of heavily redacted files linked directly to Vance's badge number, the Unseen Trap. These files detailed a localized, completely off-the-books detainment protocol. It was a shadow system designed to bypass standard booking procedures. The documents referred to a holding facility that did not officially exist on any precinct blueprint. The system was funded through diverted municipal budgets and protected by a labyrinth of legal loopholes surrounding undisclosed detentions. Chief Vance was not just a corrupt police officer. He was operating a secret parallel justice system entirely outside the bounds of the law, where individuals could be held indefinitely without a trial, without legal representation, and without any public record of their existence. Julian sat at his desk, drinking stale coffee, feeling a surge of triumph. He was downloading the decrypted files onto an encrypted flash drive, gathering the exact proof he needed to expose the entire operation. He believed he was outsmarting a small-town police chief. He believed his physical distance from Oakhaven kept him safe. This is where the reality of the situation diverges sharply from Julian's perception. While Julian felt empowered by his discoveries, he was entirely unaware of the silent threat tightening around him. The horror of this case does not stem from masked intruders or violent confrontations. It stems from a quiet, creeping paranoia and the sheer power of a corrupt system. Julian did not know that Chief Vance's surveillance network extended far beyond the borders of Oakhaven. He did not know that the initial corrupted hard drive he received in the mail was not a gift from a guilty whistleblower. It was bait. Vance had intentionally leaked the damaged drive to see if anyone possessed the technical skills necessary to reconstruct the footage. The moment Julian's computer pieced together the video file and connected to the municipal database, a silent alarm was triggered on a secure server in Vance's office. The audience can see what Julian cannot. We know that Vance is actively monitoring every single keystroke Julian makes. We know that the encrypted connection Julian believed was secure has been compromised for days. As Julian casually sips his coffee, bathed in the blue light of his monitors, he feels entirely in control. He does not notice the unmarked black sedan that has been parked across the street from his apartment building for the last 48 hours. He does not see the men inside the vehicle logging his sleep schedule and intercepting his cellular signal. He is unknowingly walking into a carefully constructed trap, guided by the very people he thinks he is hunting, the invisible cage. To fully grasp the nightmare Julian is about to experience, we have to examine the psychological toll of complete isolation and the terrifying power of administrative control. When we think of danger, we usually picture a physical threat. We imagine a weapon, a chase, or a fight. But the most dangerous weapon a corrupt authority possesses is the ability to sever a person's connection to society. They can turn the modern world into an invisible prison without ever touching their victim. Julian finished copying the files to his flash drive. He grabbed his coat and his car keys, planning to drive to a federal courthouse in the neighboring state. He intended to bypass the local authorities entirely and hand the evidence directly to a federal judge. He walked down the stairs of his apartment building and stepped out into the crisp morning air. He walked over to his car, pressed the button on his key fob, and nothing happened. He assumed the battery was dead. He manually unlocked the door, sat in the driver's seat, and put the key in the ignition. The engine would not turn over. The electronic dashboard remained completely dark. A modern car relies entirely on its internal computer system, and Julian's vehicle had been remotely disabled. Frustrated, but not yet panicked, he pulled out his mobile phone to call a taxi. The screen of his phone displayed a strange error message. He had no cellular service. The signal bars were completely empty, replaced by a flashing symbol indicating that his network access had been deactivated. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He left his car and walked quickly down the street toward a local diner, intending to use their public landline. When he arrived at the diner, he ordered a black coffee just to have an excuse to use the phone. He handed his credit card to the cashier. The woman swiped the card through the machine. It beeped aggressively. She frowned, tried it again, and shook her head. The card was declined. Julian handed her a second card from a completely different bank. That card was also declined. He walked to the cash machine in the corner of the diner and inserted his debit card. The machine did not ask for his personal identification number. It immediately swallowed the card and displayed a message on the screen stating that the account had been frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. In a matter of minutes, Julian's entire financial existence had been erased. He rushed back to his apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat down at his computer, intending to check his bank accounts online. When he opened his internet browser, he was greeted by a massive red banner from the state licensing board. His private investigator license had been permanently revoked overnight, citing a phantom ethics violation that he had never even heard of. He checked the local police registry database using a backdoor access portal he had created years ago. He typed in his own name. A warrant appeared on the screen. His vehicle had been flagged as stolen, and he was currently listed as an armed and dangerous suspect, wanted for questioning in a string of corporate burglaries. The bureaucratic system had been completely weaponized against him. This demonstrates a terrifying reality. Truth is entirely subjective when the authorities control the narrative and the infrastructure of society. Julian was abruptly stripped of his agency. He could not call for help because his phone was dead. He could not drive away because his car was disabled and reported stolen. He could not buy food or a bus ticket because his money was inaccessible. His evidence was now legally useless because his professional credibility had been destroyed by the very system he was trying to expose. He was trapped in his own home, experiencing a profound and absolute helplessness. The threat was not a masked killer breaking down the door. It was the silent, suffocating weight of an entire bureaucratic machine, erasing his credibility and his freedom in real time. He was cut off from the world, confined to a few square feet of apartment space, staring at the flashing lights of his computer servers. Julian realized the full scope of his predicament. He was not just investigating a missing person. He was fighting an entity that could rewrite reality with the push of a button. The people who made Arthur Pendleton disappear did not need to drag Julian into the woods. They could simply make it impossible for him to exist in the normal world. As he stood by his window, looking down at the street, he finally noticed the unmarked black sedan parked directly across from his building. He saw the faint glow of a cigarette ember in the driver's seat. They were not hiding anymore. They wanted him to know they were there. They wanted him to understand that they controlled every aspect of his life, and they were simply waiting for him to break. He walked away from the window and returned to his desk. He reached for the final, uncorrupted video file on an offline monitor. It was a secondary piece of footage he had managed to extract from the damaged hard drive, one he had not yet had the time to fully analyze. He knew that the authorities were likely already walking up his staircase. He knew his time was completely gone. He put on his headphones, took a deep breath, and prepared to watch the tape, hoping to find one last piece of leverage before his door was kicked in. The final seconds. Julian sat in the dim light of his cramped apartment, staring at the thick, heavy oak door that separated him from the hallway. The silence in the building possessed a strange, suffocating weight. He could hear the low, persistent rumble of the city traffic miles away, but the immediate space around him felt entirely devoid of life. He knew the men from the black sedan were already inside the building. He knew they were moving through the ground floor lobby, their boots tracking dirt across the old linoleum tiles, their hands resting on the grips of their holstered weapons. The reality of his situation settled over him like a dense fog, numbing his extremities and making his chest ache with every breath. He was trapped. His communications were severed. His finances were locked behind impenetrable digital walls, and his professional identity had been reduced to a criminal warrant in a county database. He turned his attention away from the door and looked at the secondary computer sitting on the edge of his wooden desk. This machine was ancient, a heavy dust-covered tower connected to a thick glass monitor. It was an offline system, possessing no wireless network cards and no connection to the outside world. It was a digital island, immune to the surveillance net Chief Vance had cast over his life. Julian reached forward and pressed the plastic power button on the front of the tower. The machine whirred to life with a loud, mechanical groan, the internal cooling fans struggling to spin up to speed. The monitor crackled with static electricity, casting a pale blue glow across Julian's face. He picked up the heavy metal flash drive containing the final, uncorrupted video file. This was the secondary piece of footage he had managed to extract from the scorched platters of the damaged hard drive. He gripped the small metal rectangle between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the cold surface against his skin. He pushed the connector into the port on the front of the computer tower. The machine registered the new hardware with a soft chime. A small folder icon appeared on the center of the desktop screen. Julian moved the computer mouse, the cursor tracking slowly across the digital landscape. He hovered the arrow over the file. The title of the document was a string of random numbers and letters, a meaningless designation generated by a recovery algorithm. He felt a sudden, intense hesitation. He knew that clicking the button would initiate the final sequence of events. He knew that whatever truth waited inside that video file would be the last thing he experienced before the men in the hallway kicked down his door. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the stale air of his apartment. He clicked the left mouse button twice in rapid succession, the slow crawl of time. The media player opened on the screen, presenting a wide rectangular window of pure absolute blackness. The visual track remained dormant, but the audio track engaged immediately. Julian reached for his large studio headphones, pulling the thick leather cups over his ears to block out the ambient noise of his apartment. He wanted to isolate his senses, to immerse himself entirely in the digital recording. The moment the leather formed a seal around his head, the sounds of the approaching men vanished, replaced by an intimate, claustrophobic soundscape. A heavy, rhythmic breathing filled his ears. The sound was distinct and incredibly close, as if the person recording the footage had their lips pressed directly against the microphone membrane. He could hear the rush of air being pulled through human nostrils, the slight, ragged catch in the throat at the peak of the inhale, and the slow, controlled release of breath from parted lips. It was the sound of a living creature maintaining its composure under immense physical distress. Beneath the breathing, Julian could detect the faint ambient hum of an industrial environment. He heard the electrical buzz of alternating current running through overhead light fixtures, a high-pitched vibration that rattled the teeth. He heard the squeak of rubber soles shifting against a hard floor. The visual track finally flickered to life. Here, the script must implement explicit time dilation, stretching out the fractions of a second to examine the microscopic details of the environment. The pacing slows down to an excruciating crawl. The black screen flashes with a brilliant, blinding white light, forcing Julian to squint his eyes against the glare of the monitor. The image stabilizes, revealing the sterile interior of an interrogation room. The walls are constructed of cinder blocks, painted a dull, lifeless grey that seems to absorb the light. The ceiling features a grid of textured acoustic tiles, stained with yellow watermarks in the corners. A long fluorescent tube hangs suspended from the ceiling, its plastic cover cracked down the middle. We focus entirely on the micro-actions occurring within the frame. The fluorescent light bulb flickers with a rapid, inconsistent pulse, casting harsh shadows that dance across the cinder block walls. The camera captures the exact millisecond a shadow stretches across the scratched linoleum floor, elongating and warping over the uneven tiles. The air in the room is thick with suspended particulate matter. Dust motes float in the sterile light, drifting in slow motion, tumbling over one another in invisible air currents. The microphone picks up a new sound, a slow, agonizing scrape of metal grinding against a hard surface. It is the sound of a heavy steel chair leg being dragged across the floorboards. The noise stretches out for 3 agonizing seconds, vibrating through the audio track with a metallic shriek that makes Julian grit his teeth. The swaying frame. Julian leaned his weight against the edge of the wooden desk, pressing his face mere inches from the glowing glass of the monitor. He analyzed the geometry of the interrogation room, trying to establish the exact position of the recording device. The camera was not mounted high in the corner of the ceiling, where a traditional security lens would be positioned to capture a wide angle of the space. The perspective was entirely different. The vantage point was situated at eye level, roughly 4 feet off the ground, looking straight ahead at the opposite wall. The image on the screen was not static. The edges of the video frame drifted up and down with a subtle, persistent motion. The camera was rising and falling in a rhythmic, organic pattern. Julian stared at the moving borders, his mind calculating the frequency of the motion. The sway of the frame matched the exact tempo of the heavy breathing on the audio track. The camera was not attached to a wall bracket or a tripod. The device was strapped directly to a human chest. Every beat of the person's heart, every expansion and contraction of their lungs, translated into a slight physical tremor on the screen, the perspective mimicking the natural, undeniable rhythm of a human pulse. The person wearing the camera was sitting in the metal chair in the center of the room. The dragging sound had been the individual shifting their weight, pushing the chair back from an unseen table. The physical presence of the person holding the camera felt overwhelming. Julian could almost feel the weight of the straps across his own chest, the heat of the device against his sternum, the bright glare of the overhead light burning into his retinas. The immersion was profound and terrifying. He was experiencing the interrogation from the inside out, sharing the exact sensory input of the captive individual. The camera remained fixed on the blank grey cinder blocks, the dust continuing its slow-motion dance through the air, while the heavy rhythmic breathing vibrated through the leather headphones. The glass wall. The perspective began to change. The individual wearing the camera moved their torso, initiating a slow, deliberate rotation to the right side of the room. The grey cinder block wall slid across the screen, disappearing past the left edge of the frame. The camera panned across a metal table, capturing the deep scratches gouged into the aluminum surface, the reflection of the fluorescent bulb glaring off the polished metal. The rotation continued until a massive pane of glass came into view, dominating the entire right wall of the interrogation chamber. It was a large, rectangular, two-way mirror, a common architectural feature designed to allow observers to monitor suspects without being seen. The surface of the glass reflected the stark, clinical lighting of the interrogation room, throwing a bright, distorted copy of the metal table and the cinder block walls back toward the lens. However, the illumination in the adjacent observation room was not entirely dark. The lighting on the other side of the glass was dimmed, allowing faint outlines and shapes to bleed through the mirrored surface. Julian focused all his attention on the dark rectangle behind the glass. Two distinct figures stood in the shadows of the observation room. The camera ceased its rotation, locking its gaze entirely on the mirror. The individual wearing the recording device was staring directly at the glass, confronting the unseen observers. The glare on the surface of the mirror shifted slightly as the camera angle settled, allowing a clearer view of the faces hidden in the dark room. The man standing on the left side of the observation window was Chief Robert Vance. Julian recognized the sharp, angular jawline and the broad shoulders immediately. Vance stood with his arms crossed over his chest, wearing a pristine pressed police uniform. His posture was rigid, commanding, and entirely relaxed. He did not possess the frantic energy of a police chief desperately searching for a missing man. He exuded the quiet, terrifying confidence of an apex predator observing a caged animal. The man standing on the right side of the observation window was Arthur Pendleton. Julian felt a cold shock ripple down his spine, a physical sensation that paralyzed his muscles and stopped the breath in his throat. This was the man who had supposedly vanished into a blizzard. This was the man whose empty casket had been buried in the frozen ground, while the entire town mourned his tragic demise. But the Arthur Pendleton standing behind the glass did not look like a victim. He was not wearing the ragged, torn clothing of a man who had wandered lost through the snowy wilderness. He was wearing a dark, expensive tailored suit. His hair was neatly combed, his skin was healthy, and his expression was entirely devoid of fear. He looked calm, calculated, and completely in control of the environment. He held a thick manila file folder in his hands, resting it against the glass as he looked down into the interrogation room. The ultimate plot twist begins to unfold, dismantling every assumption Julian had made over the past 3 years. Arthur Pendleton was not the one holding the camera. Arthur was not a captive being interrogated by corrupt police officers. Arthur was standing beside Chief Robert Vance, operating as an equal partner in whatever dark enterprise they were conducting. They were standing in the observation room together, looking through the two-way mirror, observing the individual strapped into the metal chair. The man in the chair. The camera attached to the chest of the captive individual made one final microscopic adjustment. The person leaned forward, bringing the lens closer to the surface of the two-way mirror. The background reflection of the cinder block walls faded out of focus, and the direct reflection of the individual wearing the camera came into sharp, horrifying clarity. Julian stared at the monitor, his mind struggling to process the visual information being fed through his optic nerves. The person sitting in the interrogation chair, the person whose heavy breathing had been echoing in his ears, the person whose perspective he had been experiencing this entire time, was not a nameless suspect. The face reflected in the two-way mirror was his own. Julian Hayes was staring back at himself through the lens of a camera strapped to his own chest. The man on the digital screen possessed the same dark, unruly hair, the same sharp cheekbones, and the same pale complexion. But the man in the reflection looked broken. He had deep, bruising circles under his eyes. His skin was slick with cold sweat, and his expression was completely vacant. It was the face of a man who had been hollowed out, a vessel emptied of its contents, staring blankly at the men behind the glass with eyes that held no comprehension and no memory. Julian sat in his apartment, frozen in the chair, feeling the foundational pillars of his reality crumble into dust. The air left his lungs in a sharp gasp. His hands began to tremble, shaking the heavy wooden desk and rattling the plastic keyboard. The video file was not a recording of Arthur Pendleton's final days. The footage had not been erased to cover up the disappearance of a local accountant. The massive deletion protocol, the destruction of the hard drives, the missing off-site tapes, all of it had been executed for a completely different reason. The footage was erased to hide the fact that Julian Hayes had been sitting in that interrogation chair, the true mastermind. The fractured pieces of the mystery began to violently realign, forming a new image so terrifying and absolute that it threatened to shatter Julian's mind completely. The truth he had been hunting for years had always been buried inside his own skull, Arthur Pendleton was never the tragic victim of a harsh winter or a corrupt police department. Arthur was an accountant, a quiet man who managed numbers, moved assets, and facilitated transactions. He was the ledger keeper for a massive, sprawling embezzlement scheme that had drained millions of dollars from the county municipal funds over the course of a decade. But Arthur did not possess the architectural brilliance required to build such a sophisticated criminal enterprise. He only managed the daily flow of the stolen money. The original mastermind, the grand architect who designed the shadow accounts, constructed the impenetrable shell corporations, and structured the invisible pipelines that siphoned the municipal budgets, was Julian Hayes. Julian was a brilliant, corrupt forensic accountant long before he ever adopted the persona of a private investigator. He was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that guided the theft of an entire region's financial lifeblood. When the authorities, led by Chief Vance, finally uncovered the massive hole in the county treasury, they realized the scale of the crime was too vast to prosecute publicly. A public trial would expose the corruption of local politicians, judges, and municipal leaders who had unknowingly approved the fraudulent budgets. It would collapse the entire regional government in a firestorm of scandal and federal oversight. Chief Vance needed to recover the stolen millions, but he could not afford to involve the federal authorities. He struck a quiet, mutually beneficial deal with Arthur Pendleton. Arthur would surrender the ledgers and help untangle the complex web of shell corporations in exchange for his freedom. To protect the secret, Arthur was systematically erased from public record. The blizzard provided the perfect cover story. The town held a funeral, the case was closed, and Arthur was brought into the shadow facility to help the police drain Julian's hidden accounts. But Julian presented a far more dangerous problem. He was too smart to crack under traditional interrogation methods, and he had hidden the primary access codes to the offshore accounts in a secure digital vault that only he could open. Vance could not kill him, because the money would be lost forever. Vance could not put him in a standard prison, because Julian would use his leverage to destroy the town leadership. The chemical detainment. Chief Vance resorted to an experimental, highly illegal solution to neutralize the threat and extract the information. The hidden files Julian had discovered in the county database did not just detail a secret holding facility, they detailed an illicit chemical detainment protocol. Vance's team strapped Julian into the metal chair in the interrogation room. They attached the recording device to his chest to document the procedure. Then, they introduced a powerful cocktail of experimental neuroinhibitors directly into his bloodstream. These chemicals were designed to violently disrupt synaptic pathways, shattering short-term memory retention and systematically overwriting long-term identity markers. The drug stripped away Julian's memories of the embezzlement scheme, burned away his memories of his past life as a corrupt accountant, and completely erased his knowledge of Arthur Pendleton. They hollowed out his mind and poured a fabricated narrative into the empty space. They convinced the broken shell of a man that he was Julian Hayes, a rogue private investigator living on the fringes of society, obsessed with digital forensics and cold cases. They released him back into the world, setting him up in a cramped apartment in the city, surrounded by computer servers and fake case files. They placed him inside an invisible cage, monitoring every phone call, tracking every digital footprint, and logging every keystroke. They wanted him to use his brilliant forensic skills to hunt down the missing money, believing he was solving a crime for a client, while they watched from the shadows, waiting for him to uncover the access codes they needed, the trigger and the reset. However, the human mind is a resilient organism. Memory is not simply stored data that can be deleted with a command prompt. Memory is woven into the physical architecture of the brain, tied to emotion, instinct, and subconscious recognition. Fragments of the truth always attempt to bubble to the surface. Julian kept feeling an undeniable magnetic pull toward the Oakhaven case. He kept pulling on the loose threads of Arthur's disappearance because his subconscious mind recognized the lie. He knew the narrative was false because he had built the very foundation the lie was resting on. The authorities understood this risk. Chief Vance knew that Julian's intellect would eventually lead him back to the center of the maze. The erased security footage was never meant to cover up a crime. It was a carefully constructed psychological trigger, a weapon designed specifically to target Julian's fragile mental state. The moment Julian got too close to the truth, the moment he proved he possessed the technical skills to bypass their municipal firewalls and uncover the secret detainment facility, Vance executed the failsafe protocol. He intentionally leaked the corrupted hard drive to Julian's apartment, disguised as a gift from a guilty whistleblower. Vance wanted Julian to rebuild the video file. He wanted Julian to watch his own interrogation. The sheer shock of seeing his own face strapped to the chair, combined with a latent post-hypnotic suggestion embedded during his chemical conditioning, was designed to induce a catastrophic psychological collapse. The realization that his entire identity was a manufactured lie would shatter his cognitive defenses, causing his mind to completely shut down and reboot. It was a brutal, efficient reset button, designed to send him back to zero. The cycle begins again. Julian sat in his chair, the heavy headphones pressing against his skull, listening to the sound of his own desperate breathing on the digital track. He looked at his hands, watching them tremble violently. He tried to remember his childhood, his parents, his life before the cramped apartment, and found nothing but a vast, terrifying void. He was a ghost, haunting a life that did not belong to him, investigating a crime he had committed against himself. The sound of heavy boots walking down the hallway outside his apartment suddenly stopped. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Julian stared at the heavy oak door. The brass doorknob began to turn with a slow, deliberate scrape. The locking mechanism slid out of place with a loud, definitive metallic clack. The men in the black sedan were not here to kill him. They were not here to arrest him or drag him into the woods. They were here to administer the next dose of neuroinhibitors. They were here to wipe the slate clean, to erase the progress he had made, and to reset the parameters of his invisible cage. They were going to wipe his memory once again, leaving him to wake up in a few days with a new cold case file on his desk, starting the phantom hunt all over again from the very beginning. The true terror of this case is not that the authorities can make a man disappear into thin air. The ultimate nightmare is realizing that they can allow you to continue living, perfectly unaware that they have rewritten your entire existence, leaving you to desperately hunt for a truth that you yourself buried. If you think the authorities in this case went to disturbing, unnatural lengths to manipulate the human mind and bury their secrets, you are not prepared for what happened when an entire community conspired to keep their mouths shut. The answers to that mystery are waiting for you in a quiet town, hiding a terrifying secret. So click the video on your screen right now to step directly into the next investigation.